The views expressed in this podcast are solely our own. This information is provided for your convenience. It does not constitute legal advice, nor does it create an attorney-client relationship. Prior results do not guarantee similar outcomes. This is attorney advertising. Enjoy.
Hi, welcome again to Red Flags Rising. My name is Mike Hunnicky. I'm a partner at Morgan, Lewis & Bockius LLP in their international trade and national security practice in Washington, D.C. With me, as always, is my great friend Brent Carlson, the founder and Chief Solutions Officer of Red Flags Rising Solutions LLC. Today, Brent, is Thursday, July 2nd, 2026. Just after 3 p.m. U.S. Eastern. We're a few days ahead of celebrating the 250th anniversary of the founding of the American Republic. How are you doing today?
Mike, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that not all regulations are created equal. Great to be here, Mike, talking about important topics and how little misunderstandings can create potentially big problems and how to avoid them.
Exactly. Well, Brent, we've been talking for some time about different patterns we're seeing across recent export controls enforcement actions brought by the Bureau of Industry and Security in the United States Department of Commerce. One thing that we've been trying to, frankly, make sure we understand better and that we're connecting the dots correctly on has been the de minimis rule. The way this works is that if you are producing something in the United States, it leaves the United States, and someone outside of the United States incorporates your thing into their bigger thing in an effort, frankly, to help U.S. exporters and to reduce the burden of U.S. export controls. For a long time, BIS has allowed exporters to declare components or items to not be subject to the U.S. EAR, Export Administration Regulations, if they are below a certain threshold percentage of the foreign thing that is being produced with them. Typically, it's at 25%. For some embargoed countries, it drops down to 10%. But Brent, this is a highly technical rule. People write entire chapters of books about it. BIS even has a de minimis guidance as part of the EAR, and we'll put links to all of these parts of the Code of Federal Regulations in the show notes in case that would be useful for anybody. We did not think today it was going to be useful to listeners, either their ability to stay awake or their mindset to go into those technical regulations. What we wanted to do is look at when things go wrong, why did they go wrong, and looking at 3 recent cases, all from 2026, all that included misperceptions or misapplications of the de minimis rule. What should you apply today in your company going forward if you are a company that is relying on the de minimis rule? Brent, there's a lot of concepts, a lot of defined terms in complex regulatory regimes that, to me, keep conjuring up the image of a weather vane. Yeah, it's the same words on the paper, but depending on the geopolitical and national political winds and which direction those winds are blowing, the arrow can point in an entirely different direction, just like that. Past practices that maybe were arguably consistent with the language of these rules or the exceptions to these rules are just by the fact that they were an accepted practice doesn't mean that BIS will continue to accept that practice. These cases illustrate 3 examples of where somebody was surprised because they thought they were operating within the confines of this rule. Brent, what's your take on some of the challenges that the de minimis rule poses, especially after having seen some of these enforcement actions?
One common misunderstanding is just assuming that, if the value falls below the de minimis threshold, then it's a license-free zone. It's just like, don't need it whatsoever. That's a bit of a misunderstanding because it's important to remember that there are item-based controls, end-use-based controls, and then user-based controls. Especially when looking at the end-use and end-user, you get some more catch-all provisions that start coming into play. When a company is doing a determination on whether or not they need to apply for a license, it's not like, you pass one test, you can forget about all the other ones. It's any one of those possible triggers for a license are valid, and you have to look across those to make sure that you're capturing them.
Look, how these things were interpreted and applied by BIS in the past does not preclude BIS from taking a more aggressive view of these in the future. These things are inherently subjective. What is fair market value? Who gets to decide that?
See, this is where I think transfer pricing calculations and practices are going to come into play, because you're setting this value over here, but you're setting a different value over there. It's something that could create an opening for a liability pitfall if you're not careful. Compliance teams need to be thinking about this as they're going through these. Look at the purpose behind these rules and how they evolved over time. De minimis is there because the U.S. government doesn't want to burden companies on administrative paperwork on low priority items, right? But now that world has changed. And so that you see BIS taking a different view on things and bringing out new tools like the foreign produced direct product rule, like applying the full definition of knowledge under the EAR to breathe new life into these old regulations to make them much more effective for the current conditions.
Well, Brent, listening to you articulate that, one thing that hopped into my mind, and it may be a half-baked idea, but people could be caught in a pretty nasty place if on the one hand, they have been trying to reduce the declared foreign origin content of items to minimize tariff exposure, but then maybe at the same time trying to reduce the U.S. content percentage of those same items from an export control perspective, given the efforts by the U.S. government to use analytical tools, to use AI. They opened a national AI center in the Pacific Northwest recently. We've been seeing in the context of healthcare fraud cases, the government trumpeting its use of big data tools like large language models and AI tools. It would be interesting to see if the government at some point starts asking people to compare, well, what have you been declaring on the inbound for these items compared to the outbound? Now, maybe why that's a half-baked idea is that the same good may not be heading in both directions, but there's probably some way, shape, or form where those two practices might have a sort of Venn diagram where they overlap a bit in the middle. Certainly, if you were a company engaging in exports but also imports of other things, you would want to make sure there's an intellectual and factual cohesion between how you're valuing inputs and outputs.
Well, that's a really good point, Mike, because you can't have your cake and eat it too. In the world that we live in, that's filled with data all over the place, and now we got increasingly powerful AI tools to go through them. Look, government's not going to sit there like a bunch of dummies and just like have the wool pulled over their eyes. Same thing for compliance folks. You should understand where there may be data within the enterprise that may contradict certain positions that are taken. Look, it goes back to where calculating fair market value. Keep a sense of that in terms of where there may be some discrepancies, because at a certain point, everything's hidden in plain sight. Understanding that will help stay in compliance. One of the issues with the de minimis rule, it also reflects that legacy assumptions on U.S. export controls can fall down and open up potential liability pitfalls if they're not being rethought. There are a lot of common misunderstandings about this. It's important because the issue is applying for a license. It's not like if you find, one test doesn't work, so I don't have to apply for a license, jurisdiction doesn't apply. No, you got to look for these other factors or triggers that would apply for a license. For the de minimis, that's looking at the item itself. So that's item-based control. And then it goes back to, is there an end user-based control? Where do the catch-alls apply? In some of the cases we'll talk about here, they overlooked the foreign direct product rule as a trigger for an export license when they should have. Part of that is just missing the point and just applying that old legacy assumption. We're below the de minimis threshold, everything's fine. Well, you got to look for other factors that are in play here. Monday morning quarterbacking is always easier than being in the fray. One of the things I think about that recent case, the $36 million case with the company in the automotive component sector, is that actually it was a success for the company in dealing with some potential issues. You can sort of nitpick and focus on where things fell down, but it ended up being a successful resolution for the company for this particular issue. I think it's important to highlight that. In the compliance world, people get like the rap of focusing on the negative. There's a positive aspect to this all too. That's what it comes back to with the whole thing on compliance. It's best not to get caught up in problems, not to let issues go unaddressed, because if you're addressing all these risks proactively, the company can focus on its core mission and not be distracted by compliance snafus.
Where are the pitfalls? If you're living in a world where the de minimis rule is being used at your company, you're likely well aware of the technical details that you have to walk through and work through in order to claim applicability of the rule. We don't need to go over that with you here, but the thing that we thought would be interesting would be, okay, well, based on what we're seeing otherwise in terms of broader export controls enforcement trends and the way that the Bureau of Industry and Security, particularly the Office of Export Enforcement, is looking at the de minimis rule, and it's been shouting from the mountaintops recently in a series of 3 settlements that we'll go through. What are the pitfalls that you need to avoid? what were some of the misunderstandings as documented in public settlement agreements that can be teaching moments for your company if you've had the good fortune to not be investigated yet, or maybe you're in the middle of an investigation and a settlement discussion with BIS.
The real key point here is that the signals from BIS now are coming really through these enforcement cases that are coming out. It's really important to pay attention to them and look at the lessons learned from them, because BIS is also taking its time to explain these. That is what compliance teams should be looking at in terms of reassessing where they may have some of their legacy assumptions that are now potentially no longer applicable in the current situation.
That's a great point, Brent. That's exactly what you said in the last pod about the IA diffusion rule. And we talked about David Peters at the Office of Export Enforcement speaking through his charging decisions as a former DOJ prosecutor. People put a lot of time into these settlement agreements, and especially into the facts in the settlement agreements. Those facts are ironed out over many months in many cases between the companies, the Bureau of Industry and Security, and the lawyers involved. This is no small thing. This is very deliberate, what is in here. And it's meant to be read, and it's meant to be used as a teaching tool going forward. Brent, it might help to deconstruct the de minimis rule a bit at the very, very basic first principle level. When you talk to startup founders and creators, that's a lot of times how they had the creative spark or saw something a little bit differently than other people saw it. At the end of the day, what is the de minimis rule, Brent? It's a fraction. This is arithmetic. But if you remember back to basic arithmetic and you started talking about division and fractions, there are two parts to any fraction. There's a nominator, the number at the top, and a denominator, the number at the bottom. Now, when you're dealing with a rule that can have huge implications because it may allow for you to export without a license, the temptation is going to be to modify what otherwise might be the denominator down, thereby reducing the percentage of U.S. content in some other item, or by artificially increasing the denominator with the same idea to reduce the percentage. In these cases, we see a little bit of all of the above. So, Brent, for example, regarding the denominator and reducing the top number in your fraction, there was a recent case from late February 2026 involving thermal imaging cameras and related components and sensors. The penalty here, Brent, was $1 million flat. One of the charges in the settlement agreement was under the heading of one of the inchoate provisions that you and I have talked about, these things existing in the background that close loopholes that people often overlook. This one in particular is 764.2H, evasion. It is a separate offense to engage in conduct that BIS considers to be an effort to evade U.S. export controls. In that particular charge, among the several charges in this settlement agreement, the exporter providing a camera into a Chinese drone negotiated a market collaboration fee or a market co-op fee. The allegation in the settlement agreement is that this fee was designed in part to push the value of controlled U.S. content to less than 25% of the fair market value of the commercial drone camera as a whole. This pricing structure was designed in part to evade EAR licensing requirements. Now, you and I read that paragraph just before we started recording, Brent, and both had the same thought. Well, gosh, that's also interesting from a knowledge perspective. It sounds like if someone was designing, that's pretty deliberate, in order to evade, that suggests there's some kind of knowledge, maybe not of the specific Code of Federal Regulations citation and paragraph and subparagraph, but certainly introduces the concept that somebody knew what they were doing was not legal under the regulations. And so query whether we see later at some point some follow-on individual prosecution, or if we see just in the future that BIS and DOJ are really focused on packaging 764.2H allegations with related offenses or even willful conduct charges that one might expect to walk hand in hand with the elements of a evasion violation. The other thing, Brent, that's interesting, not only for the nominator analysis, but also when we talk about denominators, in many of these cases, what is BIS comparing the current asserted valuation to? They're comparing it to past practice and past conduct. you and I have talked about the importance of focusing always finite time, effort, and resources in export controls compliance on those dynamic risks where something is changing. So if, for example, a new export control goes in place and makes it more difficult to ship to somebody, but you might still be able to use the de minimis rule because application of the de minimis rule is not excluded by the new control, and suddenly you change how you're calculating it, that's something that the government noticed here, and that's something that the government will take note of.
Really jumps out in my mind here is also like that saying that we've used before. It's when perceived loopholes create liability pitfalls. To give a fair shake to the people that were doing these calculations, I bet there was no discussion of evasion or diversion in that analysis or internal correspondence whatsoever. But it doesn't matter what vocabulary was used. What matters is what actions ensued. Let's say something has changed in the business and they're looking for, are there ways where the company can still ship without applying for a license? And it's got to be careful here in terms of how that process is going to unfold.
Brent, let's move on to another case that not only mentioned and turned on the de minimis rule, but quite unusually made the point of including an exposition of sorts by BIS under a category of the settlement agreement called other considerations that went on for almost 2 full pages, where BIS is just articulating, in case there was any confusion, its present view today of what the de minimis rule means and how it should be applied. And again, think of this metaphor of a weathervane kind of spinning in the wind. The words are the same, but the wind has changed. What might have been an accepted practice or way of interpreting it in the past might now be different. In that particular case, this was in early February, Brent. It involved the export to SMIC in China of semiconductor manufacturing equipment. This was a very large penalty of $252 million. Brent, this case was essentially all about the de minimis rule because it involved an interpretation of the rule taken by the company involved that would allow it to apply the de minimis rule in a favorable way if goods that had been assembled in the United States, including foreign-produced items that were typically brought into the United States for assembly were instead all shipped to South Korea where the assembly was done there. This was a very interesting case in terms of the dynamic nature of how BIS looks at conduct and intent, because BIS points to the past practice and it essentially invites the question, well, if the company involved had always been assembling these items in South Korea, might there have been at least some better argument that it could have made about why it was doing things there? The fact that it moved things there after a major customer in China had been put on the entity list was something that BIS took to mean that the reassembly or final assembly in South Korea was an artificiality, was a construct designed to manipulate the de minimis rule and make it available by creating a foreign item where instead previously there had been a U.S. item. In this way, Brent, this case is about the denominator in your de minimis fraction. The last case we talked about was the nominator, how to reduce the value of the U.S. content. Here, this is about increasing the overall pie to include a larger, quote-unquote, foreign bit of content.
In all these situations, it's important not to get lost in the weeds. It's easy to do when you have this sort of rules. Yes, on a certain level, they are complex. And we've heard that a million times. It's, oh, these rules are complex. They are complex. They are. They can be. But it's like what's important is to apply that first principles approach that you're talking about, Mike, that Occam's razor approach, and say, okay, where do the risks lie on this? And how is the world changing? I like your Weathervane analogy. How have the geopolitical, the domestic political, the regulatory enforcement winds shifted? How are they now going to be looking at this stuff? Keep rethinking those assumptions that your compliance program is resting upon. It's a different mindset in terms of thinking about export controls and complying with the EAR than it was in the past. The new mindset is really important, is to understand where are the national security drivers pushing all this and where do you want to just stay away from that and avoid even the appearance of trying to potentially evade the EAR. Now that there has been talking about old tools that have been rediscovered and redeployed, the full definition of knowledge under the EAR and how that can come into play. If the compliance team is still stuck on old assumptions, we're saying, well, let's scratch our heads and maybe we can kind of like change the numerator on this. You can change the calculation formula on this and everything's going to be hunky dory. No, it's not. Look, if you've got a new novel approach to the EAR, before running and gunning with it and banking on it, maybe run it by some of the folks at BIS to get their take on it. It's a big waste of time to get it wrong. Then you have to go back and fix it. This is the proverbial ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Brent, you're absolutely right to point back to the high probability standard, which is a standard, as we've talked about before, itself is not scientific. It is not a fixed in stone definition. Its definition has changed, I think, when you look over time, certainly in the context of how BIS, at least anecdotally, we've gathered, may have been thinking about it 20 years ago or 30 years ago compared to how they think about it today. Is it a standard that actually narrowed the definition of knowledge, or is it one that expanded it? And do you think differently when you look then at the DOJ expanding it in the context of the FCPA since 2004 compared to what may have been a view in 1996 and what that meant and what impact it would have on enforcement? When you look at the de minimis rule, it's full of similarly, let's say, squishy or subjective terms. One paragraph worth highlighting in this other considerations section of the settlement we were just talking about is this one. And it's quoting from the BIS guidance for the de minimis rule that it publishes. U.S. origin controlled content is considered, quote, incorporated into something larger for de minimis purposes if the U.S. origin controlled item is, and then it lists 3 different criteria, all of which have to be met. First, essential to the functioning of the foreign equipment. What does essential mean? Where do you draw those lines? Customarily included in sales of the foreign equipment. And we're talking about custom, we're talking about past practice, and re-exported with the foreign produced item. So again, what is the typical business practice? What are, as we've said in other contexts before, the underlying economic realities of what typically would happen? That's a struggle because what this is really saying is look into the point you just made about if you think you have some novel interpretation of these regulations, it is a good idea to think about, well, is there a way to go and vet this with them? Look, there's a lot of media coverage out there about decisions taking too long at BIS, especially over on the export administration side in terms of licenses and guidance and advisory opinions, which would be the relevant path you would want to walk here. But there may be informal ways to at least socialize this with people where you're at least going to get a reaction. You'll see a facial expression, maybe the eyebrows go up, or maybe you just get, no, actually, we understand where you're coming from. At least there's some guidance you might get in terms of directionally, are you on the playing field or have you gone off-piste, so to speak, in a way that may cause you harm? Fair or not, one of the things that quote I just read and that these settlements emphasize is what you have done in the past is the foundation for how BIS will view what you're doing now. If you're anticipating, which is exactly the case it was in the settlement, that a revenue stream, that a product flow will be impacted by likely coming regulations, they're going to ask you, are there legitimate ways we continue these exports, right? And it's the classic observation / joke about tax optimization versus tax evasion. Where is the line, or is that line maybe a bit fuzzy depending on who you ask? It could be a similar thing here, but when you're talking about national security, the government gets to make that decision first. This is not a democratic process unless you elect somebody different that might take a different view later. So it's really important to keep that in mind. To your point, Brent, about the risks of getting this wrong and how those can snowball, that really brings us to the third decision from the end of June of this year involving a company that was manufacturing micro-electro-mechanical systems, sensor products, and software. They were exporting those to Huawei. Part of how that happened was that a person working at this company in Germany erroneously commingled, and I'm reading, Brent, from the settlement agreement here, the concept of the de minimis rule, which depends on a certain amount of incorporated U.S. origin content that is controlled for a destination, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the concept of the foreign direct product, or FDP rule, which we'll be discussing in a future podcast, Brent, because it carries the same tendency to be misinterpreted and misapplied in a way that carries liability consequences for people, as does the de minimis rule. In the settlement, BIS then continues that this concept of the FDP rule depends on the software, technology, or equipment used to produce an item rather than any certain percentage of incorporated conduct.
Buyer beware. The U.S. content fell below that threshold, so no license was required. Well, it was just literally right after the foreign produced direct product rule got applied and expanded on to Huawei. And that's a different topic. It requires the application of a license, and it got missed by the compliance folks at the company. Before that FDP rule got expanded and applied, the assumptions that the compliance team were operating under before that may have been correct. That only changed with the change in the regulations. That's why it's important to keep in mind where these things are evolving, because that's going to have a big impact for any business. You're not going to leave money on the table. You're not going to go voluntarily walk away from business where it's perfectly valid and fine. But then when those regulations do change, or when you do have that shift, that's important to really pay attention to that, because that's what BIS is going to be paying attention to as well. It's that simple. Some of the stuff to get lost in the weeds is what you can do in the offsite or on the summer barbecue and say, but otherwise keep focused on what's important.
Good summer barbecue reference heading into the 4th of July weekend here in the United States, Brent. That tees up this episode's managing up. What is your managing up today, Brent?
Let's not get lost in the weeds. Always remember that the situation is changing, being driven by unfolding geopolitical and national security dynamics. Remember that perceived loopholes can turn out to be liability pitfalls. What may have been perfectly a valid assumption in the past now can just turn out to be a potential liability time bomb. Always be continuously rethinking those assumptions that gird your compliance program. It's important to be re-evaluating these things, because I think just psychologically people have certain assumptions that stick. And it takes a lot of repetition sometimes. That's a good thing for compliance folks to remember. Sometimes you got to be saying this again and again for it to sink in and stick. But by continuously rethinking your assumptions that are driving your compliance program, you can stay ahead of the game. The company can be focused on its core mission and not be distracted by compliance regulatory snafus. What's even more important now is to understand that the world has changed. BIS has changed. They're under bipartisan pressure to also keep things moving forward. This is national security at the highest levels. They're signaling through these enforcement actions the key takeaways, and to always keep reassessing some of these legacy assumptions. I mean, it's so easy for all of us, whether at work, whether at home, and whatever, and we have certain assumptions of how some things work, and that gets fixed in our brains, and it doesn't change. And it's like, well, no, we always have to have the beginner's mind. We always have to be open to new things, how the world has changed, how we are going to think about it, how we are going to act upon it to be most effective in all facets of our life, professionally and personally.
Well said, Brent. That concludes this episode of Red Flags Rising. As always, it was a pleasure. And to you and all those out there, be well.
Thanks, Mike. Take care.